Yeah, it's been a while since I've done one of these, and I decided I was going to do another one. Kind of got in the mood for it and got bored with the other ones. And now it's all on the first firearms, which is really kind of a passion area of my life because I started in black powder. I didn't start using smokeless powder until a lot later in life. So here we are, first firearms, black powder, let's go! Let's engage with it. So you have your match locks and your flint locks and your wheel locks and your cap locks and your rock socks and your cock locks and your cock blocks. And it's all good. I love every part of it, especially the black powder. And look at those thick rim glasses. So this one I've not seen before. Well, I feel as though I might have seen it way back in, when it aired, but I don't remember it. But I know all of this stuff anyways. And black powder is what I started out using with flintlocks and cap locks when I was a kid. So it's always had a special place in my heart, and I really want to get back into black powder, but it's a little bit more expensive nowadays than what it was back then. Those reenactors with those brown vests is just so pretty. And I bet you a lot of them have the Charlottesville muskets too. Now, I'm not adept enough at picking out the differences immediately. If I had one in my hands, I could tell you from proof marks and everything. But just glancing, I don't know. So I guess Tom Cruise is going to drop in from the ceiling and try to steal something in here. Looks like the area for Mission Impossible. And I'm sure he's saying something interesting. Guy Wilson, master of the armories. Okay, this has got to be some British place. And today you'll go with me while I explore the wonderful history of the first firearms. My British accent's atrocious. I will not be doing that at all for the rest of this. So if you're unaware, firearms pretty much originated in China, where that's where black powder was created by the... You wouldn't call them alchemists because that's more of a... what am I trying to think of? Well, alchemy itself has some very interesting origins. It's always about like transmutation of materials, where they were looking to... It's not necessarily to turn things into gold, but it was trying to get like the elixir of life, trying to create new substances. And that's where the word chemical comes from, is from alchemical substances. With black powder, the Chinese are the ones that first invented it, mixing sulfur and charcoal and saltpeter. And they were the ones who started using it in fireworks and stuff, and then they had tubes of bamboo that they would pack full of black powder and rocks, and it would shoot them out like a primitive shotgun, except you could only do it once or twice. Kind of like Captain Kirk with the Gorn on that planet, It's, even if you've never seen Star Trek, you know the fight I'm talking about. Well, the Mongol influence with taking out part of the Chinese Empire at that time, because it was split into two different empires, the northern and the southern. The Mongols dominated the northern, didn't dominate the southern for many years to come, but with the Mongolian influence and the trade road, the Silk Road, the trade routes and everything, the black powder eventually made its way into the Arab hands, where I believe by the Last Crusades, if my timeline's correct, and it might not be, because I think the Last Crusades were in like the 1280s, and by that time Kublai Khan, not Kublai Khan, sorry, he's much later, Genghis Khan had died, so the trade routes were already established. The black powder was already in the hands of the Arabs and the Middle Easterners, and from there it went into the hands of the Europeans, where they started creating handguns, which are these little tubes here, which are just iron, and very, very primitive stuff. You have a little spike on there to hold it in place on a stick, or potentially it's been theorized it's been used as a weapon, but I don't really think that is, because it's not a proper spike. It's just a little like wedge, as you can see there. I fucking hate saying "as you can see," so I'm going to try to limit that, but it's a very natural thing for me to talk to somebody people fuck anyways, to talk to people and say "as you can see" in there. But yeah, so these soldiers, who I believe are French, or maybe Swiss. I know the painting, but I'm not entirely sure which ones were in the black armor. But they have crossbows, so they're not English. They would use these handguns, which are very ineffective unless you were basically standing in the other person's boots. But you pour powder down, you put a little ball down, and you ram it all the way down. And then you put a fuse or a piece of string at the back, and you try to light it with a slow burning match. This guy's using just a little bit of black powder too. And then you would set it off. If you have volley fire of these, they could be relatively effective, but they still hadn't quite worked out volley fire by this point. But the Chinese never really created firearms. They created fireworks and bombs and other things with them. It wasn't until it got into the hands of the Arabs and the Europeans that firearms really took off. And the Europeans were the ones who developed firearm technology, and the Turks too. The Turks are a big group to work with that. And originally, cannons, the reason that gun barrels are called barrels is because the cannon barrels were made just like barrels, where you take strips of low-quality iron and you put them around like you would a barrel, and then you cover the outside with strips and rings of iron, and they would be made just like barrels. So the term barrel has stuck since then, and it's over 500 years old. More than that, honestly. But yeah, you can see black powder there going off. You can see, God damn it, I fucking hate that too. Fuck you and your beard, dude. So these are English longbow archers, and that's obviously the flag of St. George, the cross of St. George. So, I mean, the longbows, they were relatively effective. They could get distance, and they were pretty good. But once you started getting development on the black powder weapons that moved away from the handgun and moved more towards the arquebus, a arquebusier could carry more powder and more shot, and then a longbow could arrows. A longwoman could arrows. It required a lot less training. It was a lot less expensive to equip a force of arquebusiers, and because the lead balls were moving at a much higher velocity than the arrows, they would go right through plate armor. You'd have particularly heavy joints where some of the plates would overlap that they couldn't punch through, but for the most part, they would just completely go through plate armor. And then there were other parts of it too where they would lose velocity. There are other instances where they would punch through the first part, lose velocity, go through the person, bounce off the back plate, and go back through the person, just creating massive, devastating wounds. Yeah, see, the longbowmen can get shots off quicker, but if you connect with the lead shot, it's much more devastating. And it also got up to the point too where plate armor was so well constructed that even a bodkin arrow from a longbow had a very difficult time penetrating on a straight hit. You'd have to hit stuff like joints and whatnot to be even mildly effective. So there's crossbowmen up there. Crossbows could deliver more energy with a larger pole, but even then, they still just weren't nearly as effective as black powder weapons. Although it's still a lot of fun. I've got a crossbow, and I love it to death. And I've done a lot of crossbow shooting, and there's the winch we put in there. I can't remember. Is it called like a spade foot or something like that? I used to know all the terminology for it, but I've never owned a medieval crossbow. The one that I've got currently is a handmade one from Leaf Springs that somebody made from a kit, plans. It was just the plans from Popular Mechanics, and then they made it back in the 70s, and it works fantastically. Yeah, so see all the loading step process, you have to go through a crossbow of that power. You have to put on the winch, and you have to grab the string, you have to crank it all the way up, set the string, and then you have to decrank it and pull it off and then put a thing on there and fire. Whereas with a handgun, you pour the powder down, ram the ball down, put a little bit of powder, hit it with a match, and then you can do that all over again. Now, with black powder, you really should blow down the barrel, just a quick like that, to make sure there's no embers still in the barrel, because if you pour another load of powder down in the barrel, you're going to get a flash right up in your face. If there's still embers. That's a very pretty example. I'm surprised any of these have survived at all. With where were they buried? Did somebody throw them in a peat bog or something? Were they in an armory and they just never got raided? So the guns themselves were ineffective, but the cannons were amazing. Well, and you have to think too, when they were first started showing up, people had never seen this before. They'd never seen anything like this. Their excuse me. Their version of warfare was very noisy. But then you had this gun that showed up, which was even louder and noisier, sounded like thunder cracking, spewed smoke. There's a lot of the people thought they were the devil at first. And it would, with the cannons, you would just break down castle fortifications much quicker than you would with an onager or a trebuchet. And onagers were never really effective at breaking down walls just because they couldn't get that much power through twisted ropes. But with trebuchets, they were a lot more effective. But then cannons supplanted trebuchets. They became much more powerful. And people would go stylized with them. In here, he's hammering the barrel, which is kind of fascinating to see him work the bit of iron like that. Then I guess they weld it at the seam. Well, they'd have to, or else the pressure would just blow it up. Later on, though, with advancements in drilling techniques and everything, when they would do cannons, they would start out with a solid piece of bronze, and then they would drill down into it. And one of the people who first started coming up with the idea of, I don't want to say thermodynamics because that's not right, but started observing. I can't remember the guy's name. He's a very famous British scientist before Newton. But he was watching these cannons be drilled, and he would notice that the water in the containers that they put in there to make it so that the cannon barrel didn't overheat while they were drilling into it, after a while, after about halfway through the process of drilling down into the bronze for the cannon, would start boiling because it would be so hot from the friction of the drill working that you would get the water to boil, and then they would have to wait and let it cool down a little bit more and then continue drilling. And this is a very slow, arduous process by hand. This wasn't anything that was like our drills today, where we had really good bits that could just go through pretty much anything almost immediately quickly. I am saying all sorts of fucking words that just sound so stupid to me when I hear myself say them. Okay, so they're rolling it over and then just doing it that way. Oh, okay, so that's how they're getting the hexagonal shape. Oh, so that's probably why hex barrels looked exactly like they did, because they would square them off that way. That's kind of cool. I had no idea. So it's going to show us point of impact. Yeah. So that's some pretty thick steel. I don't know where it's going to hit. Okay. That's kind of cool, though, that you see the impact and you see the little slug kind of drop. I don't know if that's what knights would be wearing, though. It might be a little bit thicker than that. But yeah, so the cannons with the water, it was just kind of led into the development of the ideas of thermodynamics and how, you can heat things up other ways through friction and everything else. I'm sure my mind was going to go somewhere else with that, but it didn't. I wish I could grow a beard like that. I can get the bottom half kind of, but it's not nearly as thick. See, there's the bodkin. And that's a crossbow bolt because it's so thick and short. They're alright, but they're just not... They're not effective against armor at all. when you start getting up to thicker stuff. And then that's why you saw armor just disappear, because armor itself was so expensive to make and took such a high level of craftsmanship to make, that when you started getting things like effective black powder weapons showing up that would take out armor, it just started disappearing. What you would have afterwards would be something like a Morian helmet or a breastplate, or I guess you could call it a Morian. I don't know which one's the right way, but like the Spanish style helmet that the English used for a little bit, and they're showing a sabot there, and that's a tank round though. Oh, okay, I guess they're saying that modern tank rounds use the same principle as a crossbow bolt. Will have the small, hard penetrating bolt inside of a sabot, that when you fire it, the sabot, which is the part that covers it and allows it to hug the barrel, gets ripped away by the air pressure, and then the little crossbow bolt, like titanium or whatever, depleted uranium maybe, has enough of the transference of energy to impact the target and go straight into it and cause a kill on the tank. So that's 120 millimeter. Okay, so that's what's used in the Abrams then. So it's most likely, well, it would have been depleted uranium. I don't know what it is nowadays. And the Abrams has a smooth bore cannon, so the vanes would be what impart the spin on that. So that's armor piercing round for the Abrams. And now we're back at the painting. I don't know why we're referencing this painting so much. I mean, we're 16 minutes in and we're still on fucking handguns and crossbows. Let's move on to the more interesting stuff, like the matchlocks, the proper matchlocks, not these things, like the arquebus and stuff. I mean, it's a very pretty example, but to me, it's kind of like, it's just not that interesting. I mean, if I really wanted to, and if I got my forge up and running, I could probably make one of them. Okay, see that right there? That's a matchlock. And you had the tiller system like you did with the crossbow. That's where the trigger came from, was the crossbow system. And that little dragon arm thing holds the match, and it hits a pan of powder, and it goes off. And they are notoriously difficult to get reliable fire with. Especially if you have any type of moisture in the air, if it's raining at all, if it's really, really windy, sometimes the matches just wouldn't. I mean, the slow burning matches generally won't go out unless it's really wet, but even in wind, sometimes you just wouldn't get the coal to make ignition with it. These wax dummies look really, really weird. Kind of remind me of the ones at Warwick Castle. So he's explaining something else. Nice little tan sweater with a red tie. At that point, though, why are you even wearing a tie? If that's like a quarter inch of your tie is all that's going to be showing, why wear it? Why don't you just do your tie, put your collar outside of your sweater, look a little bit more sophisticated. He's probably British. I mean, they all do such weird things. If you ever meet anybody who's from England and says that they invented the language, that's bullshit. Modern English is a combination of several different languages. The original language was Celtic, and that's what a version of Celtic. That's what the Romans encountered when they got to Britain, and then some Roman words came with that, and later on the Saxon invasions and then the Norman invasions. Oh, sorry, Normans were Norman was a lot later, but the Viking invasions. And, Normans technically were the descendants of Vikings and everything else. But then it's a bastardized language that's an amalgamation of so many different other languages. It's just evolved into its current form. Especially when I got over to America, it started adopting a lot more into it. Basically, that's my long-winded way of saying, fuck you, Brits. So, yeah. And then you got Pikeman helping them out. And Mr. Wilson again. He was looking at the camera, saying nothing. They were almost halfway done, and there's really been nothing that interesting. And I'm kind of flagging at this point, because I'm like, I don't know what the hell else to talk about. I mean, he's got a matchlock, sure, but They're not showing any demonstrations of it. I've already told you the principle of how it works. I mean, it's. I could go into, the Giordani air rifle or the Puckle gun, the stuff that existed, and the Whitworth was Civil War. Is it Ferguson or Peterson? A breech-loading rifle from the Revolutionary War period, 1776, where you could get off several shots a lot quicker than through muzzle loading. Had a really unique screw mechanism too. Okay, so now we're back to demonstrations. I'll get back to those in a minute. But yeah, you see the evolution of the trigger there from the crossbow tiller, which is the trigger, to that actual thing you pull there. And you've got the pan and the flash of powder. It's such pretty things, seeing it go off like that. So he's holding a really nice example of one. Yeah, it's got kind of the old stock where it's all blocky. It's effective, it works. And I would love to fire that. So the early designs were innovative for the time. I mean, you can't just immediately come up with technology from nothing. You have to build upon all the designs that existed previously. That's the way that evolution, that's the way that technology works. You don't suddenly get a trait out of nowhere. Well, you kind of do with mutation, but the potential for... I'm going to sound like an idiot because I don't really know what I'm talking about through biology, but through technology, you can't just develop something from nothing. In order to go to an AR-15, you have to start out at the basic level with the Chinese bamboo tubes, then you have to go to the handgun, then you have to go to the matchlock arquebus, and then you have to go to the flintlock brown bass, and then you have to go to the caplock Springfield rifle, or rifled musket if you want to be more accurate. And then from there you have to go on to the cartridge weapons, and then you have to go from there to semi-automatic operations with gas operation on their direct impingement, which is the way that the AR-15 uses. So there's a whole bunch of steps and like 400 to 500 years worth of technology. God, stumbled over that word. Technological advancements that had to have happened in order for you to get to an AR. And an AR is antiquated technology at this point. It's well over a decade, god damn it. It's well over half a century old, and there are better advancements, but it is a very stable rifle in its performance and its adaptability to new calibers and new configurations, which makes it great. So what they're doing here that I've completely disregarded is hand fitting every single part, and this is the way that you used to have to do that, which is why gunsmiths were so highly prized and such a mastercraft occupation. There we go. That's what I was looking for. Because generally you would have to create everything by hand, and everything would have to be fitted by hand so it all worked. And no piece was the same as any other. There was no interchangeability. That didn't come along until a lot later. Now, Eli Whitney's the one who's credited with that, but the Whitney rifles that he did with the interchangeability were crap. The stuff that he demonstrated that you could have interchanging parts was actually set up that way. And his first real kind of foray into it didn't really work that well. It wasn't until a little bit later, with other manufacturers kind of starting to standardize their stuff and make everything exactly the same, that true parts interchangeability came around. But you see here how he's heating up the barrel, and then he's dropping it into the stock, and that'll kind of burn off a little bit of the wood and seat the barrel properly. And he's saying something, I have no idea what. I like his beard too. I just want a beard. Where was I going with all this? I don't know. You could be talking about firearms. I could talk for years. But yeah, so interchangeability and all that. And that's a nice long one. Okay, let's take a look. Same gauge steel. I don't know what gauge steel that is, but it should have more velocity and should be able to punch through or at least make a bigger dent. Okay, so it's a dent. Oh no, it punched through. See, there you go. So it's going all the way through now at this point because you've gotten a much better barrel technology. It's much stronger and it's longer, so it can take a bigger powder charge than the handgun could. It's much more accurate, and you have this length that the powder, when it burns, will build up pressure behind the ball, and that's what's forcing it. It always takes the path of least resistance. So the path of least resistance is forcing the projectile out so the pressure can equalize pretty much. Because you suddenly have all this huge pressure in the chamber of the rifle, or at this point, the smoothbore arquebus, that it wants to equalize. The pressure wants to get back to zero. So it will take the path of least resistance, forcing the lead ball out at tremendous velocity. And then it can equalize pressure. As soon as the lead ball goes out the other end of the barrel, there's nothing else pushing it. So from that point on, it's slowing down. But if it hits something within, I want to say 50 yards at maximum with it, it's going to do a shitload of damage because it's moving so fast. Later on, when you get up to the bigger caliber weapons, like 75 caliber, and some of them even went over 100 caliber, which is a larger diameter ball. You know, some of them were over an inch in diameter, which caliber is a measure of inches. So when I say 75 caliber, I mean 0.75 inches. When I say 100 caliber, I mean 1 inch in diameter. So when you would get hit by something like that, traveling at 800 feet per second, it would break your bones in half. And that's what happened a lot with people during the Revolutionary War and later on the Civil War, is they would get hit in the leg or they would get hit in the arm, and it would quite literally shatter every bone in their arm because it was such a heavy hitting thing that wouldn't stop for the bone. Now it would get deflected to some degree, but at that point you're just gone. Whereas you look at a 5.56 round, which is a much, much smaller round. It's only 0.223 inches in diameter. So it's just looking at like a 75 caliber, it's, you know, like 2 times less in diameter than a 75 caliber. Moving at 3,000 feet per second, it's an incredibly fast projectile. It will break your bone if it hits it, but it's also more likely to go straight through things and do a much smaller amount of damage. It's a much more efficient round, though, when you start pairing it with certain hollow points and everything. But that's not what we're here to talk about. That could be an entire another narration video in and of itself. But let's go back to these things. So you have this massive chunk of lead slamming into a target, and it's just utterly devastating. Oh, those are some gorgeous pistols. Now we're up into the flintlock era with dueling pistols. I honestly completely disregarded everything the guy was doing before he opened up these pistols. That is so pretty. Look at that. So that's a wheel lock there. What that was, and it was theorized, but it was designed by Leonardo da Vinci. It's basically like a cigarette lighter, where if you take a cigarette lighter and you roll your thumb over the wheel and then hit the ignition, what it's doing is it's sparking a little flint and causing a spark to come up. And that spark comes up, and then when you hit the ignition, the butane comes up, and that spark ignites the butane, so then you have a light that you could light a fire with or light your cigarette with. Wheel locks operate on the exact same principle, where they would have a piece of flint that's there. Well, you can't see. I just pointed to the screen. That's there in the arm. So you take a key and you crank the wheel up, and then when you cock that back, see, he's cranking the wheel right now, and then when you pull the trigger, that hammer up there looking thing will come down onto the wheel, and the wheel starts spinning, and it will create a bunch of sparks. Sparks go into the pan of powder that's there, and that will go into the chamber, igniting the main charge in the chamber, which takes the path of least resistance again, if you remember, and pushes the lead projectile out at incredible velocities. Now, by modern standards, the velocity is not much at all, but back then it was faster than any arrow could go, and it was pretty much the fastest man-made thing available. So yeah, it makes contact there with the wheel spinning. They were incredibly expensive to make, and it took an awful lot of precision, so only kings and nobles could pretty much afford them. These were not common everyday weapons or everyman weapons. Oh, just the pure mechanical genius of it. It's so pretty. And it took... that's great. It took until the mid-1800s for them to adapt that to not cigarette lighters, but adapt that to lighters. I don't know if they looked at the wheel lock and thought this principle could work in that context, or if they came to it independently. I'll have to look that up. I'm not entirely sure. I do know matches were invented before lighters, though. Oh, look at that bloody wonderful craftsmanship. It's all unique. It's all hand-fitted. Like, I am a big admirer of engineering on that type of scale. And in small arms engineering. Like, if you ever want to see something that's utterly insane, go look up the... Oh my god. Is it the G2000? The caseless H&K space rifle. It looks like a box. The internals look like a German clock. It is so crazy. Man, I love those pistols too. Like, dueling pistols are just very, very pretty. And, you know, they're not all dueling pistols. They're only dueling pistols if they're made specifically for dueling. But I, just label them as dueling pistols. Yeah, that's a nice little flintlock thing. So flintlock was a little bit different. It took the principle of the wheel lock and simplified it. Whereas you had the frizzen, which is the part of steel that the flint hits. And so you'd have a piece of... let's see, these are dueling pistols. You'd have a piece of flint that would impact with the frizzen and drive sparks down into a pan underneath the frizzen that would ignite everything. And so patch and ball, they started using patches to create a much tighter seal to get better accuracy. And then by the time the military things came around, like the French and Indian War, the Revolutionary War, and the Napoleon's War, they had done away with the patches again. And mostly soldiers were issued with paper cartridges. But I'll get to that later. Let's see what these guys are going to do. So even though that you have a patched ball in a pistol which probably had rifling, these things were woefully inaccurate compared to modern handguns. And a lot of people trained with them, but there's still so many factors with a low velocity ball like this. Oh man, that's so gorgeous though. I love like the craftsmanship and I love the wood. That frizzen is so stylized. It's utterly beautiful to me. The flint itself is really interesting. It's fossilized sea sponges. So it's an incredibly hard material that when you impact it against steel will create sparks on the steel, but it's very brittle. I've made blades out of flint and stuff, but it is a brittle material that will shatter, and so you'd have to carry replacement flints. And each flint, you'd wrap a little piece of leather around it to kind of hold everything in securely. Yeah, that's so nice. I'm just admiring the pistols in action. Oof, I love that shot. So they probably won't even hit each other. Well, I guess they did. Now, medical technology being what it was back then, a wound like that, it may have been survivable, but if it hit anywhere in your gut, it would be a slow, agonizing death. Yeah, see, when you look at it, it's a very simple set of mechanics to a simple set of engineering for the flintlock and everything, but it's wonderfully beautiful. When you have a trigger which releases a sear, which releases the hammer when it's cocked all the way back, and there's a spring to, set against the hammer to forward it, push it forward, and advance it. And here you have 2 lines of reenactors. Okay, so these paper cartridges, they would have a cartridge box which would be full of paper cartridges, and if you're looking at them, that's the black box hanging off of that's the black bag pretty much hanging off of their shoulder. Paper cartridges were just black powder and a ball that was in paper, and so you'd pull it out, you'd bite the back of it, you'd pour the black powder down in, and then you put the entire thing in with the ball, and you ram it down into the musket, and it would create a little bit tighter of a seal than if you had just dropped a ball down in there, but it was still a musket. It didn't have any rifling in it. It was straight walled. So they were very inaccurate. You really couldn't hit anything beyond 50 yards, and that's why most of the warfare back then was this type of volley fire, where you have disciplined ranks firing volley after volley at the other person, and you're just basically wearing the other side down until they broke rank, or until they advanced and fought you in hand-to-hand combat. That's when it got exceptionally brutal. I mean, we've all seen the scenes from The Patriot, and it's not inaccurate on the combat as they were doing it, but it's just so ridiculous compared to modern standards of warfare. And then when you got into the Civil War, they were doing the exact same motherfucking things that they had done in the Revolutionary War with the volley fire and everything. But the problem with it is the weapons had become so much more advanced. Rifling was much easier to make. So you had spring-filled and end-filled rifled muskets that were very accurate out to a couple hundred yards, and you were lobbing gigantic balls. I guess he's just trying to hit a piece of paper. See, even at that distance, that is piss-poor accuracy with a cap and ball revolver. Come on, dude. I guess he's supposed to be Bill Hickok. Oh, there's that little brass piece one. The fuck is that? Well, yeah, flintlock revolver. How about that? See, this type of shit existed back during 1776, but... Okay, so as I was saying, though, with the Civil War, they were doing the exact same tactics of volley fire with weapons that could kill to a couple hundred yards, and they were just mowing down people left and right. It was just utterly bloody and utterly insane. So this is a prime example of weapons that existed back during the Black Powder era. When people start talking about how the Second Amendment doesn't cover multiple shot weapons, they're ridiculous. The Founding Fathers were not stupid. A lot of them were inventors themselves, and a lot of them owned firearms like this. This is nothing new to this design. One of the earliest revolvers was the puckle gun, which existed long before the First Amendment. Well, that too. Long before the Second Amendment, though, was written. You also had things like the Giordani air rifle, which had like a 26 capacity on some of their models. And you had these other type of revolvers. Now, these were not mechanical revolvers. These were hand revolvers. So you'd have to advance them to the next cylinder space after every firing. However, Samuel Colt was the one who invented the first mechanical revolver. So what that means is when you're cocking the hammer back, it advances the cylinder to the next space. So when you cock the hammer back, you have the mechanical force advancing the cylinder. You have another ball lined up, and then you pull the trigger. It fires, the ball goes from the cylinder down the barrel, and so on. And it always makes me laugh when they're like, well, the Founding Fathers could never have anticipated AR-15s. It was written only to cover muskets. No, it wasn't. It was written purposely to be ambiguous about what type of firearms it covered and what type of arms it covered, because it doesn't just mean firearms. It doesn't just mean arms. It means everything. And the militia was not the military. The militia was every able-bodied person. So it's written in very clear English. It's the fault of the people who are trying to interpret it these days for not understanding the English it was written into. Goddamn Brits and their fucking L-85s and Shit, that's such a junky weapon, man. They still continue to use it, though. Of course, the same thing could have been said for the AR, but the L85 series did have an awful lot of problems just because it wasn't that well made to begin with, and Brits being Brits, so fucking stubborn, they wouldn't, change it because it was a British-made weapon. So now they're talking about bayonets, and that's another love of mine so much. So the original bayonets or plug bayonets would go right into the end of the barrel, like the one that you saw before. And these ones are socket-type bayonets, so you could put them around the barrel like a socket, and you could still shoot through the bayonet. Loading it with the bayonet on would be incredibly difficult. And bayonets are some of the most violent, some of the most vicious things to engage with in combat. They aren't used very much these days. They're still issued with a lot of weapons. But at the point where you're basically running into another line of people, it's just pure primal, man. You're spearing them with the damn bayonet. You're sticking them with this thing which is 1 to 2 feet long. God, it's just insane to contemplate, especially like bayonet charges and stuff. It's so insane. It's such a visceral form of combat. Well, at least shooting somebody, you shoot them and then you can move on if they're dying or something. I mean, it's just a pull of the trigger, but this stuff, you're right up personal, and he's giving you basic instructions with it. You're sticking them with it, you're clubbing them, you're getting in there, you're trying to keep them from sticking you. I mean, nobody wants to be hit with that, but then, other people also don't want to hit with that. Oh my god, Enfield's. And the 1907 sword bayonet. I love that. Enfield is one of my favorite rifles. And there's the spike bayonet on the Mark II, or the number 4 Mark II. But I've long, there's the plug, there's the socket. I've long loved bayonets. They're like one of my favorite things. So I guess they're just gonna go through going all over again. That short little, almost useless one. It's comical. I mean, they're still issued though. They can double as a combat knife, which is good. Sometimes, you have to be up close and personal. Such a junk gun, though. And of course, they'd never adopt the AR because it's an American design. They'd have to have something of their own. Volley fire, though, for the individual soldier was much easier to do than taking precise aim shots. Now, there's all the studies that were done in World War II that a lot of people just fired in the general vicinity of the enemy and didn't really aim their shots. They didn't want to. It's almost done. But at least volley fire, the soldiers could all shoot together and at a mass target. They didn't have to pick up individual targets. So this has been, what the fuck is this one called? Primitive Weapons, First Firearms? I don't remember. But anyways, 1998, there you go. So have fun. It's been great.